In the summer of 737 AD, a Frankish army under Charles Martel, the Hammer, crushed an Umayyad relief force at the mouth of the River Berre in southern Gaul, drowning thousands in the salt marshes and turning the lagoons red with blood in what would become one of the most brutal yet forgotten battles of the 8th century. Our silver-armoured GoodKnight stood in the Frankish shield wall that day, not on some distant hill like at Tours 5 years before, but in the press of a vicious interception battle where the enemy had nowhere to run but into the sea. This wasn't a defensive stand. It was a calculated ambush, a tactical masterpiece that annihilated an entire army yet failed to capture the prize it was meant to save. As the Umayyad fleet landed south of the besieged city of Narbonne, believing they had achieved surprise, Martel's intelligence network had already set the trap, and the valley of the Corbières would become a killing ground where heavy cavalry shattered against an immovable wall of Frankish iron, where commanders fell in the melee, and where the survivors clawed over each other, trying to reach their ships as Frankish warriors pursued them into the water with sayax and spear. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that place you in the heart of history's most pivotal and brutal moments, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten battle you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that blood-soaked summer of 737 AD, when victory tasted like salt and ash. Chapter 1. The road south, the dust rose in columns that could be seen for miles. The GoodKnight rode in silence, his silver armor catching the late spring sun as it filtered through the canopy of oak and pine. The Via Domitia, the ancient Roman road, stretched before him like a scar across the landscape, its paving stones worn smooth by centuries of legions, merchants, and now the army of Charles Martel. He was not alone. Around him rode hundreds of men, the professional corps of the mayor's household troops. These were not farmers called from the plough. These were the vassi, the sworn retainers, men who had campaigned in Frisia against the pagans, in Saxony against the forest tribes, in Aquitaine against Duke Eudo's rebels. They were hard men, their faces weathered, their eyes distant. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said on a dozen other roads to a dozen other wars. The GoodKnight's horse, a sturdy Frankish gelding, not the swift Arabian coursers of the enemy, plodded forward with the patience of a beast that knew the rhythm of war. The knight's mail, Bernie, hung heavy on his shoulders, the thousands of riveted iron rings pressing down with a weight that never truly left, even in sleep. Beneath the mail he wore a padded gambeson soaked with old sweat. The heat was building. They were moving south, away from the cool forests of Austrasia, into the Mediterranean world of stone and scrub and merciless sun. He thought of the north, of the cold rivers, of the beech forests where the light came green through the leaves. That world felt distant now, like a memory from another man's life. Ahead, the column slowed. Word passed back in low voices. The scouts had returned. The GoodKnight urged his horse forward, weaving through the press of men and pack animals. The army was a moving city. Thousands of warriors, camp followers, priests, blacksmiths, the wagons carrying the siege engines disassembled into timber and iron, the herds of cattle driven along for meat. It was a machine, and Charles Martel was its engineer. At the head of the column, the Hammer himself sat astride a black stallion, his broad frame unmistakable even at a distance. He was not a tall man, but he radiated authority. His face was scarred, his beard streaked with grey. He wore no crown. He was not a king, merely the mayor of the palace, the power behind the Merovingian throne. But every man in this army knew the truth. Charles was the realm. The scouts knelt before him, their horses lathered and blowing. The good knight could not hear the words, but he saw the hammer's expression harden. A decision was made. Orders were given. The column began to move again, but the pace had changed. There was urgency now. The good knight returned to his place in the line. A companion, a grizzled warrior named Hrodgar, spat into the dust. "Avignon has fallen," Hrodgar said quietly. The good knight said nothing. He had expected as much. The city had been held by the traitor Maurontius, the Duke of Provence, who had invited the Saracens into Frankish lands. The hammer did not forgive traitors. "They say Martel put the garrison to the sword," Hrodgar continued. "Every last one. Hung Maurontius from his own walls." The good knight adjusted the strap of his shield. Mercy was a luxury in this war. The Umayyads had held Narbonne for nearly 2 decades, transforming it into a fortress, a base from which they raided deep into Gaul. They had burned monasteries, enslaved Christians, and carved out a piece of the old Visigothic kingdom for their caliph in distant Damascus. The Franks were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival. "Where are we going?" the good knight asked. Hrodgar grinned, showing gaps where teeth had been. "South, to Narbonne. The hammer means to take it." The good knight nodded slowly. Narbonne. The name carried weight. It was the key to Septimania, the last Umayyad stronghold north of the Pyrenees. If it fell, the Saracen threat would be broken. If it held, the war would grind on for years. He looked up at the sky. Vultures circled high above, black specks against the blue. They were patient creatures. They knew that where armies marched, they would feast. The days blurred together. The army moved like a great serpent, winding through the valleys and hills of Provence. They passed through villages that had been abandoned, their fields overgrown, their churches burned. The war had been here before them. At night, the good knight sat by the campfires and listened to the priests chant psalms. The words were Latin, ancient and solemn, a reminder that they fought not just for land, but for faith. The Umayyads worshipped a different god, followed a different prophet. To the Franks, they were the enemies of Christ, the servants of darkness. But the good knight had seen enough of war to know that the enemy bled the same red, cried out in the same pain, and died with the same fear in their eyes. He did not hate them. He simply knew that one of them would have to fall, and he intended it to be them. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, the army crested a ridge and saw it. The city of Narbonne. It sprawled across the plain, a jumble of Roman walls and Visigothic towers, the River Berre glinting silver as it wound past the fortifications. Beyond the city, the land opened into salt marshes and lagoons, and beyond that, the Mediterranean Sea stretched to the horizon, endless and blue. The good knight stared at the city. Smoke rose from within its walls. He could see the banners of the Umayyad garrison flying from the towers, green and white, the colors of the caliphate. The city was alive, defiant. Charles Martel raised his hand, and the army halted. The hammer turned in his saddle and looked back at his men. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the ridge. "We will take this city," he said, "or we will starve it into dust." The men roared their approval, beating their spears against their shields. The sound echoed across the valley, a challenge hurled at the walls of Narbonne. The good knight did not cheer. He simply checked the edge of his seax, the heavy fighting knife at his belt. The blade was sharp. It would need to be. The siege had begun. Chapter 2. The Iron Ring. The Franks did not storm the walls. They were not fools. Narbonne was a fortress city, its defences layered and deep. The outer walls were Roman, built centuries ago by engineers who had conquered half the world. The inner citadel was Visigothic, a maze of stone and timber that had withstood sieges before. And now, the Umayyad garrison had reinforced it further, adding earthworks and palisades, turning every street into a potential killing ground. Charles Martel knew that a direct assault would cost him thousands of men. So instead, he built a ring of iron around the city and waited. The GoodKnight was assigned to the western sector, where the Frankish lines ran along the banks of the River Aude. His task was simple: ensure that nothing, no boat, no swimmer, no desperate messenger, reached the city from the sea. The work was brutal. The men dug trenches and raised earthworks, hauling timber from the surrounding forests to build palisades. The sun beat down without mercy, and the ground was hard and rocky. Blisters formed on the GoodKnight's hands, even through the calluses. At night, he collapsed into his tent, too exhausted to dream. But the work continued. Day by day, the ring tightened. The Franks built watchtowers along the river, manned by archers and sentries who scanned the water for any sign of movement. They sank sharpened stakes into the riverbed to tear the hulls of boats. They patrolled the banks in shifts, their eyes red from lack of sleep. The GoodKnight stood his watch in the hours before dawn, when the world was silent and the stars were bright. He could see the lights of Narbonne across the water, flickering like distant fireflies. He wondered what the people inside were thinking. Did they believe relief would come? Did they pray to their God for deliverance? He did not know. He only knew that his orders were to hold the line. Weeks passed. The siege settled into a grim routine. The Franks did not have the numbers to assault the city, and the garrison did not have the strength to break out. It became a war of attrition, a test of wills. The Franks controlled the land, but the Umayyads still had access to the sea. Supply ships slipped past the blockade under cover of darkness, bringing grain and weapons to the defenders. Charles Martel raged at the failure. He ordered the river patrols doubled, the watchtowers reinforced. But the sea was vast, and the Frankish army had no navy. The blockade was porous, and everyone knew it. The GoodKnight saw the frustration in the faces of his comrades. They had marched hundreds of miles, endured the heat and the labor, and still the city stood. Some muttered that the siege was cursed, that the Saracens had made a pact with dark powers. Others simply wanted to go home. But the hammer did not waver. He walked the lines every day, speaking to the men, reminding them why they fought. He was not a man of grand speeches, but his presence was enough. When Charles Martel stood before you, you believed. One afternoon, the GoodKnight was summoned to the command tent. He went with a sense of unease. Summons from the hammer were rarely good news. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and leather. Maps were spread across a table, held down by stones. Charles Martel stood at the center, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Around him were his captains, hard men, veterans of a dozen campaigns. The hammer looked up as the GoodKnight entered. "You've been on the river," Martel said. It was not a question. "Yes, Lord," the GoodKnight replied. "Then you've seen the ships?" The GoodKnight nodded. "They come at night. Small boats. Fast. They hug the shore and slip past the watchtowers." Martel's jaw tightened. "And we cannot stop them." "Not without a fleet, Lord." The hammer was silent for a long moment. Then he turned back to the map. "The garrison has sent word to Cordoba. A relief army is coming." The words hung in the air like a blade. "How do you know?" one of the captains asked. "We captured a messenger," Martel said. "He talked before he died. the good knight felt a chill despite the heat. A relief army. That changed everything. If the Umayyads could break the siege from the outside while the garrison sallied from within, the Frankish army would be caught between two forces. It would be a slaughter. "How many?" another captain asked. "Thousands," Martel said. "The flower of Al-Andalus. Cavalry, archers, Berber infantry. They're loading them onto ships as we speak." The tent was silent. The good knight could hear the distant sound of hammering from the siege works, the low murmur of the camp. "What are your orders, Lord?" the good knight asked. Charles Martel looked at him, and for a moment the good knight saw something in the hammer's eyes. Not fear, but calculation. The mind of a man who had fought his way to power, who had crushed rebellions and turned back invasions, who had stood at Tours and broken the Umayyad tide. "We wait," Martel said. "And when they land, we kill them all." Chapter 3. The landing. The news came on a Sunday. The good knight was sharpening his seax when the horn sounded. 3 long blasts, the signal for alarm. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to his sword. Around him, the camp erupted into motion. Men grabbed weapons, donned helmets, formed into their units with the practiced efficiency of veterans. A rider came thundering into the camp, his horse foam-flecked and wild-eyed. He dismounted before the command tent and was ushered inside. The good knight did not need to hear the words. He could see it in the faces of the men around him. The relief army had landed. Within the hour, the orders came down. Half the army, under Childebrand, the hammer's brother, would remain at Narbonne to hold the siege lines. The other half, the elite heavy infantry, would march south under Charles Martel himself. The good knight was in the second group. They moved fast, leaving the siege works behind, marching down the Via Domitia toward the coast. The sun was high and merciless. The good knight's mail, Berre, felt like it was cooking him alive, but he did not slow. None of them did. They were the hammer's chosen, and they would not fail. As they marched, scouts brought reports. The Umayyad fleet had bypassed Narbonne entirely, landing at the mouth of the River Berre, near the ruins of an old Roman dock called Port Mahon. It was a clever move, unexpected, defensible, and it gave the enemy a clear path inland to relieve the city. But Charles Martel had anticipated it. His intelligence network, local Christians who resented the Umayyad occupation, perhaps even spies within the garrison, had given him the information he needed. The hammer was already moving to intercept. The good knight marched in silence, his mind focused on what was to come. He had fought in shield walls before. He knew the rhythm of it, the waiting, the collision, the grinding press of bodies and steel. He knew the smell of blood and shit, the screams of the wounded, the way time seemed to stretch and compress in the chaos. He was not afraid. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. They reached the valley of the Corbieres as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. The land here was different from the north, dry and rocky, covered in scrub and low bushes that smelled of thyme and rosemary. To the west, the good knight could see the glint of water, the salt lagoons and marshes that bordered the sea. And there, in the distance, he saw them. The Umayyad army. They were camped on a low rise near the ruins of a Visigothic palace, a crumbling structure of stone and timber that had once been a seat of power. Their banners flew in the breeze, green and white, the colors of the caliphate. The good knight could see the horses, hundreds of them, the pride of the Andalusian cavalry. He could see the tents, the cook fires, the glint of armor. They were a formidable force, but they were also trapped. Charles Martel had positioned his army to block the valley. To the Frankish left was the River Berre, its waters sluggish and brown. To the right was the Étang de la Palme, a salt marsh that stretched for miles. The only way forward for the Umayyads was through the Franks. And the Franks were not moving. The good knight took his place in the line. Around him, the men formed the shield wall, overlapping their shields, setting their spears, becoming a single immovable mass. The front rank knelt, bracing their spear butts against the ground. The second rank stood, their spears angled forward. The third rank held axes and swords, ready to step into any gap. The good knight was in the second rank. His spear was 8 feet long, its iron head sharp and heavy. His shield was strapped to his left arm, its iron boss polished to a dull sheen. His sayax hung at his belt, ready. He looked to his left and right. The faces of his comrades were grim, set. These were men who had stood at Tours, who had held the line when the Umayyad cavalry had charged again and again. They knew what was coming. Across the valley, the Umayyad army was stirring. The good knight could see their commanders on horseback, gesturing, shouting orders. The cavalry was forming up, the horses stamping and snorting. The infantry, Berber warriors in leather and quilted cotton, were moving into position. They had no choice. They had to attack. The Franks controlled the road to Narbonne. If the Umayyads wanted to relieve the city, they had to go through the shield wall. The good knight took a slow breath. His heart was steady. His hands were calm. He had done this before. He would do it again. And then, across the valley, a horn sounded, a long, mournful note that echoed off the hills. The Umayyad cavalry began to move. They came like a storm. The good knight watched them approach, hundreds of horsemen, their armor glinting in the fading light, their lances leveled, their war cries rising in a wave of sound that seemed to shake the earth. The thunder of hooves grew louder, a drumbeat that resonated in his chest. He could see their faces now, dark-skinned men with beards and fierce eyes, their helmets crested with horsehair, their shields painted with geometric patterns. They were the elite of Al-Andalus, the warriors who had conquered half of Iberia, who had ridden into Gaul and burned its cities. They were coming to kill him. The good knight set his feet. He gripped his spear with both hands, the shaft slick with sweat. Around him, the shield wall held. No one spoke. No one moved. They were a glacier, silent and immovable. 50 yards. The good knight could hear the jingle of harness, the creak of leather, the shouts of the riders urging their horses forward. 30 yards. He could see the foam on the horses' mouths, the wild whites of their eyes. 20 yards. The man in front of him raised his spear. 10 yards. The good knight braced, and then they hit. The impact was like the end of the world. The first rank of horses slammed into the shield wall with a sound like thunder. Spears punched through armor and flesh. Horses screamed and reared, their legs kicking wildly. Men were thrown from their saddles, crashing into the press of bodies. The good knight felt the shock of the collision ripple through the line, but the wall held. A horse reared in front of him, its rider slashing downward with a curved sword. The good knight thrust his spear upward, catching the man in the armpit where the armor did not cover. The rider screamed and fell, dragging his horse down with him. The good knight pulled his spear free and thrust again, this time into the flank of another horse. The animal shrieked and bolted, trampling its own riders. The world became chaos. The Umayyad cavalry could not break through. The terrain was too narrow, the shield wall too dense. They were forced to attack frontally, and the Frankish spears were a forest of iron. Horses impaled themselves on the points. Riders were dragged from their saddles and hacked to pieces. But the Umayyads did not retreat. They pressed forward, desperate, trying to find a gap, a weakness. The good knight felt the pressure building, the weight of bodies and steel pushing against the line. His arms burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. The heat inside his mail was suffocating. A spear thrust toward his face. He twisted, catching it on his shield. The impact jarred his arm, but he held. He stabbed forward with his own spear, feeling it bite into something soft. A man screamed. The shield wall was a machine. When a man fell, another stepped forward to take his place. When a spear broke, a sword or axe took its place. The Franks did not fight as individuals. They fought as one. The good knight lost track of time. The battle became a blur of motion and sound, the clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, the wet thud of blades cutting into flesh. His world narrowed to the space in front of him, the next thrust, the next block, the next breath. And then, somewhere in the chaos, a cry went up from the Umayyad lines. Their commander had fallen. The good knight did not see it happen. He only heard the ripple of panic that spread through the enemy ranks. The pressure against the shield wall eased. The cavalry began to pull back, their formation breaking. And then they ran. The rout was immediate and total. The Umayyad cavalry, unable to break the Frankish line, turned and fled back toward their camp. But there was nowhere to go. The Franks controlled the inland road. The only escape was back toward the sea, through the marshes and the river mouth to the ships. Charles Martel did not give the order to hold. He gave the order to pursue. The shield wall broke apart as the Franks surged forward, their discipline giving way to the primal fury of the chase. The good knight ran with them, his spear abandoned, his sayax in his hand. Around him, men were screaming, not in fear, but in rage and triumph. The Umayyad infantry, the Berber warriors who had been held in reserve, tried to form a rear guard. But they were light troops, armed with javelins and small shields. The Frankish heavy infantry smashed into them like a hammer into clay. The Berbers broke and ran. The good knight saw a man stumble in front of him, his leg twisted beneath him. The man looked up, his eyes wide with terror. The good knight did not hesitate. He drove his sayax down into the man's throat, feeling the blade grate against bone. The man's blood was hot on his hands. He pulled the blade free and kept running. The retreat became a stampede. The Umayyads were fleeing toward the river, toward the lagoons, toward the sea. But the ground was treacherous, soft and marshy, dotted with pools of stagnant water. Men in armor sank to their knees, their boots sucking into the mud. They clawed at each other, trying to climb over one another to reach the boats. The Franks did not stop at the water's edge. The good knight saw his comrades wading into the shallows, their weapons raised. They stabbed at the men struggling in the water, dragging them down, holding them under until the bubbles stopped. The lagoon turned red. Some of the Umayyads tried to swim. They stripped off their armor and plunged into the deeper water, striking out toward the ships anchored offshore. But the Franks had commandeered fishing boats from the Roman dock. They rowed out into the lagoon, standing in the prows with spears and axes, hunting the swimmers like seals. The good knight found himself in one of the boats. He did not remember climbing in. He only remembered the motion of the oars, the creak of the wood, the cold spray of the water. A man surfaced in front of the boat, gasping for air. He was young, barely more than a boy, his face pale with exhaustion. He looked up at the good knight, and for a moment, their eyes met. The boy raised his hand, whether in surrender or plea, the good knight did not know. The man beside the good knight, Hrodgar, the grizzled veteran, thrust his spear down. The boy's hand disappeared beneath the water. A moment later, a dark stain spread across the surface. The good knight looked away. The slaughter continued until the sun set. By the time the Franks pulled back to the shore, the lagoon was choked with bodies. They floated face down in the water, their arms spread, their hair drifting like seaweed. The gulls had already begun to circle. The good knight stood on the beach, his armor caked with mud and blood. His hands were shaking. He looked down at his sayax. The blade was notched and dull. He would need to sharpen it again. Around him the Franks were cheering, raising their weapons to the sky, singing songs of victory. But the good knight did not join them. He only stared out at the water, at the bodies drifting in the tide. He had won. They had all won. But it did not feel like victory. The relief army was destroyed. The heads of the Umayyad commanders were taken and displayed before the walls of Narbonne. The garrison, seeing the fate of their would-be saviors, fell silent. But Charles Martel did not take the city. The good knight did not understand it at first. They had won the battle. The enemy was broken. Narbonne was isolated, its supplies cut off. It should have been a simple matter to starve the garrison into surrender. But the hammer gave the order to withdraw. The reasons became clear as the army marched north. Scouts brought word of Saxon incursions in the Rhineland. The northern frontier was under threat. Martel could not afford to leave his army tied down in a siege that might last months. And so, the Franks left. But they did not leave quietly. As the army moved back up the Via Domitia, Charles Martel enacted a policy of devastation. Every fortified city in Septimania, every stronghold that could be used by the Umayyads, was to be destroyed. The good knight was part of the detachment sent to Nîmes. The city was ancient, a jewel of the Roman world. Its amphitheatre was a marvel of engineering, a massive oval of stone that had stood for centuries. The local population had turned it into a fortress, building walls and towers within its arches. The Franks burned it. The good knight stood in the arena as the flames rose. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. He could hear the crackle of timber, the crash of collapsing stone. The people of Nîmes, those who had not fled, watched from a distance, their faces blank with shock. This was not war. This was annihilation. The good knight thought of the boy in the water, the one who had raised his hand. He thought of the bodies floating in the lagoon. He thought of the cities burning behind him. He had fought for order, for the realm, for the faith. But what had he built? The army returned to the north as summer turned to autumn. The campaign was over. The Umayyad threat had been blunted, if not destroyed. Narbonne still stood, but it was isolated, cut off from reinforcement. It would fall eventually, not to Charles Martel, but to his son Pepin, more than 20 years later. The good knight rode in silence, his silver armor dulled by dust and ash. He did not speak of the battle. None of them did. There was nothing to say. They had won. They had saved Gaul. They had turned back the tide. But the cost was written in the smoke that rose from the cities they had burned, in the bodies they had left to rot in the marshes, in the faces of the men who rode beside him, men who had seen too much, done too much, and could never go back to who they had been. The good knight looked up at the sky. The vultures were still there, circling high above, patient and eternal. He would ride again. He would fight again. He always did. But as the road stretched before him, leading back to the cold forests of the north, he wondered if there would ever be a battle that felt like victory. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.